A signal that outruns light does more than arrive early. It rearranges the order of events themselves. The Tachyon causality paradox emerges the moment you allow a particle to exceed light speed and discover that its timeline no longer agrees with yours. What you call cause becomes someone else's effect, and the sequence you trust fractures under simple relativistic transformation. The rules do not merely bend, they contradict you from another inertial frame, as if logic itself carried a built-in glitch that only appears when velocity crosses the forbidden line. Picture a detector registering a pulse before its emitter ever activates. You check the wiring, the timestamps, the equations. All consistent, all impossible, and yet nothing in special relativity forbids this inversion once faster than light motion enters the system. At that point, you're forced to confront a quiet implication. The barrier at light speed is not just a speed limit, it stabilizes temporal order. Remove it and sequence becomes negotiable. The twist is that this instability is not exotic. It's a direct consequence of space-time geometry. Now imagine yourself holding a switch that sends a tachyon beam to a receiver on a passing ship. In your frame, you flip the switch first. In theirs, the reception occurs first. Which version of first are you prepared to defend? The more you insist on your perspective, the more another observer insists on theirs, each backed by mathematically correct Lorentz transformations. You're not arguing about interpretation. You're arguing about the direction of time along a path that physics still permits. This structure forces a question you cannot defer. If a message can be received before it's sent, who authored the event? Even defining you becomes unstable because agency dissolves when chronology loops back on itself. At that moment, causality feels less like a rule and more like a temporary arrangement. Reordering events is not a metaphor here. It is a calculable outcome of mixing superluminal motion with Lorentz transformations. Once a signal outruns light, its world line tilts so sharply across spacetime diagrams that different observers assign opposite temporal directions to it. You can check the equations yourself. A velocity greater than c forces the time coordinate to flip sign in some inertial frames. That flip is not optional. It is a geometric requirement of preserving the structure of spacetime intervals. And the moment that sign changes, before and after lose any universal meaning. Picture two observers gliding past one another in deep space. You sit inside a station, the other moves at a high constant velocity. You fire a tachyon pulse toward them. In your frame, the emission is comfortably earlier than the detection. But draw their coordinate axes, and the same pulse now slides backward in their time dimension. They see it hit their receiver first and leave your source later. The event sequence is fully consistent, just not consistent for both of you simultaneously. If you were to argue about the order, both of you could cite clean, correct spacetime algebra, and neither of you would be wrong. Where then do you place responsibility for the event? If your switch activation becomes an effect rather than a cause in some frames, your intention no longer anchors the chain of occurrences. The moment you try to claim ownership of the timeline, relativity counters with an alternative ordering that follows the same rules you used but reaches the opposite conclusion. You're confronted with a system where intention cannot guarantee precedence. Now ask yourself, if the universe allows the temporal arrow to rotate under a change of motion, what secures the direction of influence? This tension isn't a theoretical blemish. It is a sign that time's ordering is conditional, not absolute. Causality at this stage behaves like a symmetry waiting to be broken. A faster-than-light message does more than invert event order. It enables chains that return to their own origin shifted in time. The moment two observers exchange tachyon signals while moving relative to each other, the combined frame shifts allow a complete causal cycle. Mathematics predicts it cleanly. One message travels forward for you, the reply travels forward for them, and the composite path slips behind your starting point. The result is a closed influence curve. Not a metaphorical loop, but a literal return of information to a moment that precedes its own departure. Visualize the setup. You stand beside a console, sending a tachyon ping to a ship in motion. They receive it, respond instantly, and their tachyon beam outruns your outbound pulse from a different frame orientation. On your display, the reply arrives before you ever launch the first signal. You check the sequence. Your receiver flashes, the timestamp logs, and only afterward do you reach for the switch. Yet the logs insist the reply is reacting to a message you haven't sent. It's a chain with no anchor event. Try to choose where it starts, and the system redirects you to another point that also claims to be the beginning. Where in such a cycle would you locate your own decision? If you act because of a reply that depends on your action, your choice becomes entangled with its own consequences. You're not trapped by destiny, you're trapped by consistency constraints. The universe requires the loop to close smoothly, and your agency must adjust to make closure possible. You become part of a self-maintaining structure, not a free initiator of events. Consider this carefully. If your future response can dictate your past trigger, what becomes of responsibility? The equations describe a coherent system, but coherence does not guarantee interpretability. You're faced with a timeline that preserves mathematical order while erasing narrative order. At that point, influence no longer travels from origin to destination. It folds. A closed influence curve does not automatically explode into contradiction. Physics imposes a condition that keeps the loop from tearing itself apart. The requirement of global consistency. Any sequence of events, even those that wrap backward through time, must obey a single, self-consistent history when viewed as a whole. The equations do not permit partial contradictions. They permit only those cycles in which every step reinforces the others. This transforms faster-than-light signaling from a mechanism of freedom into a mechanism of constraint. You can send a message, but only if that message fits the loop the universe allows. Imagine a digital display that shows a warning message. A second later, you press a button that generates the message you just saw. The loop closes neatly. The effect instructs the cause. But try to break the cycle. Picture yourself deciding to send a different message than the one displayed. Under Tachyon dynamics, the altered message would propagate back and erase the conditions that produced your decision. You'd attempt a divergence, and the system would push you back toward a stable configuration. You feel autonomous, but the loop filters your possible actions until only self-consistent options survive. Where exactly do you place your freedom inside this structure? If the universe prohibits contradictions, then your range of choices is shaped by an event sequence in which your future behavior has already participated. You make a decision, but that decision must align with a timeline whose endpoints connect behind your back. Try to identify a moment untouched by the loop, and you discover that no such moment exists. This interpretation reframes agency as a constraint-satisfying process rather than a source of independent causation. You function more like a solution to an equation than an origin point of influence. And once you recognize that consistency governs you as tightly as physics governs the tachyons, an unsettling possibility emerges. You might not be steering the loop, you might be fulfilling it. A temporal loop sounds like a logical puzzle, but its physics has teeth. Superluminal signals imply space-like propagation, and space-like propagation interacts with energy in a way that is anything but benign. In standard relativity, energy and momentum transform smoothly under changes of frame until you cross the light barrier. Then the transformation equations force kinetic energy to behave asymmetrically. A tachyon's energy decreases as its speed increases. Push it faster, and it sheds energy rather than requiring more. This inversion destabilizes your intuition because the usual safeguards that prevent runaway feedback simply vanish. Picture a detector absorbing a tachyon. In one inertial frame, it gains energy. In another, it loses energy. The same exchange flips sign depending on who's watching. That frame dependence means a carefully arranged setup could create a cycle where energy appears to emerge from nowhere in one perspective and disappear into nowhere in another. If you try to enforce classical conservation, the mathematics pushes back, showing that energy bookkeeping becomes frame relative once superluminal motion is introduced. You're left with a physical world where the concept of cost no longer aligns across observers. Now place yourself inside a lab attempting to regulate such a system. You watch your instruments register a pulse with negative effective energy. You adjust the settings, expecting compensation from the incoming signal, yet your equations tell you that another observer would see that same pulse as positive. Which version of energy flow should you trust? The universe refuses to give you a single reference frame in which everything remains orderly. You're navigating a process whose balance sheet cannot be settled globally. This instability sharpens the earlier tension. If influence can run backward while energy flips sign, then even the idea of a timeline governed by resource constraints dissolves. Order is no longer enforced by what is physically expensive. At this point, the fabric of causation stops behaving like a protected sequence and starts behaving like an optional configuration. Once energy flow loses universal direction, the very notion of a source becomes unstable. A Tachyon exchange that closes through multiple frames can generate a message that has no identifiable point of origin. The mathematics allows a configuration in which the content of a signal is determined only by the requirement that the loop remains self-consistent. No deliberate emitter is necessary. The information simply appears as the unique solution to a constraint set, as if the message were solving for itself. Picture a console lighting up with a clear, structured data packet, not random noise, but a coherent pattern. You examine the logs and find no prior transmission. The equipment confirms that the packet influenced the system's settings, which later triggered a sequence that produced the same packet. You're not confronting a ghost signal, you're confronting a fixed point in space-time that sustains itself by meeting the consistency conditions imposed by the geometry. Try to decide whether the packet was sent or received, and the distinction collapses. It exists because the loop demands it. Now imagine yourself attempting to overwrite it. You type an alternative message intending to disrupt the cycle. But as soon as your fingers hover above the interface, the system behaves in ways that subtly steer you back toward the original content. A misalignment in the timestamp, a mismatch in synchronization, a calibration shift that forces correction. None of it violates physics. It simply nudges the timeline toward the configuration that closes the loop. You feel the pressure not as external force, but as narrowing possibility. Where in that constriction do you locate your authorship? This structure exposes an unsettling implication. Information can arise not from intention, but from temporal architecture. The loop determines what must be true, and your role is absorbed into the solution rather than standing outside it. Influence no longer flows from agent to consequence. It emerges from the requirement that the space-time arrangement remain coherent. At that point, the message persists, even if no one ever truly created it. If a message can exist without a sender, then temporal order loses its role as the organizing principle of reality. Before and after become local labels rather than global anchors. In relativity, the separation between events determines whether all observers agree on sequence. Time-like separations enforce consensus. Space-like separations allow disagreement. Tachyon dynamics push every relevant interaction into the space-like regime where no shared chronology can survive. The structure does not merely distort order. It removes the expectation that order should exist at all. Picture a clock network designed to synchronize distant stations. Under normal circumstances, each signal reinforces a timeline that all observers can interpret consistently. Introduce a superluminal link, and the network destabilizes instantly. One station registers a synchronization pulse coming from its own future, another registers it coming from its own past. You attempt to recalibrate the system, yet every correction produces new contradictions from a different frame. You're watching a framework meant to maintain order unravel because the very notion of temporal precedence has lost physical meaning. Where do you stand inside such a structure? If you check your personal sequence of events, it remains internally coherent. You still experience a linear progression, but that personal timeline no longer dictates the global evolution of the system. Another observer moving differently through space-time will assign your actions a reverse sequence that obeys the same physical laws you rely on. You both inhabit timelines that are internally valid yet mutually incompatible, and neither timeline can claim privileged status. This reveals a subtle but profound shift. Causation is no longer about earlier events producing later ones. It becomes a relationship defined only within local light cones, while superluminal interactions bypass those cones entirely. Once that bypass exists, before ceases to be a universal guide. You thought time provided structure. Here it provides only perspective. As temporal order dissolves, the system doesn't devolve into chaos, it converges toward patterns dictated by constraint rather than sequence. Tachyon-based frameworks behave less like classical cause and effect chains and more like solutions to boundary value problems. The entire configuration of events, past and future, must satisfy a global condition. This shifts the explanatory model from A produces B to A and B co-emerge because no other arrangement remains stable. Paradox becomes predictive. The loop doesn't violate physics. It reveals what physics selects when chronology is no longer the governing rule. Visualize a researcher mapping the behavior of a tachyon channel. Instead of tracking how a signal evolves, she sets boundary conditions. A detector must record a pulse at one space-time coordinate, and a transmitter must align with another. The allowed solutions are not paths that begin at one point and end at another. They're entire self-consistent trajectories that satisfy both constraints simultaneously. When she simulates the system, she doesn't find multiple timelines. She finds exactly one viable configuration. A loop structure that respects every rule except our conventional expectation that influences should start somewhere. Now place yourself in her position. You attempt to modify one of the boundaries to force a different outcome. Perhaps you delay the transmission slightly or alter the receiver's sensitivity. Yet every physically permissible adjustment collapses back into a configuration that protects the loop's consistency. You are not imposing order. You are discovering the only order the system can sustain. Your intuition seeks a narrative of progression, but the mathematics gives you a pattern of coexistence. This reinterpretation carries a sharp implication. Paradoxical behavior is not a defect of the model, but a consequence of applying global constraints to space-time structures. The loop persists because the universe identifies it as the stable solution under faster-than-light conditions. At that point, prediction is no longer about what happens next. It is about what must be true across the entire timeline. Once prediction depends on entire timelines rather than sequential causes, the status of agency becomes precarious. An action you believe originates in your deliberation may instead be a requirement imposed by the global configuration. Tachyon-compatible histories treat decisions not as initiating events, but as interior points in a structure that must already cohere. The universe isn't waiting for you to choose. It's resolving a boundary condition in which your choice appears as a necessary component of the only self-consistent timeline available. Picture yourself in a control room, preparing to activate a tachyon channel. You pause, reconsider, hesitate. From your subjective view, this hesitation feels meaningful, a sign that you might do otherwise. Yet the moment you check the system logs, you notice the incoming data packets match precisely a configuration that depends on you performing the activation. The very information you rely on has already encoded the outcome of your decision. You're not being forced physically, you're being constrained logically. Your freedom shrinks to the set of actions compatible with what the loop has already stabilized. Where do you locate responsibility within such a framework? If your action is part of a structure that extends into what you consider the future, then your intentions cannot serve as independent causes. They are embedded nodes shaped by requirements extending across time. Even your introspective sense of choosing may reflect the internal consistency of the loop rather than an unconditioned act. You find yourself in a position where your reasoning process must deliver the output that the system's geometry already permits. This tension reaches a critical point. Agency becomes indistinguishable from constraint satisfaction. You can still act, but the space of viable actions is trimmed by conditions that originate beyond your temporal horizon. The system doesn't override your will, it restricts the configurations in which your will can exist. At that point, the question is no longer whether you caused the timeline. It's whether you can step outside the one that already includes you. When agency collapses into constraint, information itself stops behaving like something that travels. In standard physics, a signal carries content from one point to another along a definable path. But Tachyon-compatible structures turn information into a relational property. It is not transmitted. It is instantiated across a configuration. The roles of sender and receiver dissolve because the content exists only as part of the globally consistent pattern. Direction becomes irrelevant. What matters is whether the pattern closes. Picture a laboratory array with two nodes linked by a superluminal channel. You attempt to map the flow of information across the connection, expecting to see a gradient, data originating here, influencing outcomes there. Instead, every monitoring device yields a timeline where the apparent origin shifts depending on the observer's motion. One measurement suggests node A generated the pattern, another suggests node B did, a third shows the pattern emerging simultaneously with no discernible source. The more precisely you analyze it, the more the notion of directional flow disintegrates. You're not tracing movement. You're uncovering a fixed relational structure that manifests differently in each frame. Where do you place your understanding inside such a system? If information lacks a privileged direction, then explanation can no longer rely on stories of propagation. You can describe correlations, but you can't assign them a temporal hierarchy. You might attempt to reintroduce direction by choosing a preferred frame, but relativity refuses to bless any frame with special status. What you gain in convenience, you lose in truth. You're left confronting a world where the existence of a message does not imply a path, only compatibility across the entire configuration. This reframing carries an unexpected consequence. Information becomes a constraint rather than a commodity. It doesn't move through spacetime, it shapes spacetime's admissible arrangements. The content of a signal is whatever allows the loop to stabilize, not whatever an agent decides to send. At that stage, communication no longer means transmitting something, it means satisfying the geometry. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. Every instability introduced by superluminal motion resolves not by breaking physics, but by revealing a deeper structure that transcends sequential causation. What looks like a contradiction from within a timeline becomes coherence when viewed as a global configuration. This forces a reinterpretation of spacetime itself. Instead of treating events as unfolding, we must treat them as coexisting elements of a four-dimensional constraint network. Tachyons do not distort time, they expose the architecture that time normally conceals. Imagine unfolding a map that includes entire histories rather than geographic regions. Your own timeline appears as a single curve on this map, but the tachyon loops form additional curves that cut across it, connecting coordinates your intuition insists should remain separate. To navigate this map, you cannot rely on next or previous. You rely on consistency conditions that operate across the entire sheet. The structure feels alien only because your everyday experience privileges one path through it, the path defined by light speed limitations. Remove those limitations and the map reveals connections that were always there. Now picture yourself stepping back from your personal perspective and examining the network from above. Every choice you believed you initiated appears as a node determined by the global constraints. Every message you thought you sent appears as part of a self-sustaining pattern. You're not witnessing paradox, you're witnessing a form of order that uses time as one of several dimensions, rather than the dimension. This view doesn't reduce agency to illusion. It reframes agency as a feature embedded in a complete structure. Your actions have meaning because they are necessary components of the only history that fits the full configuration. This higher order interpretation clarifies why faster than light signals don't simply break causality. They reveal that causality was never the fundamental organizing principle. It was a local approximation, valid only in regimes where influence stays within light cones. Tachyons override that approximation and expose the relational fabric beneath it. And once you understand that the universe selects entire histories rather than sequences, a final realization surfaces. You were never navigating the loop, you were inhabiting the solution. You can now revisit the premise that seemed impossible at the start. If faster than light particles exist, does cause and effect collapse? The answer is both sharper and stranger than the initial intuition. Sequential causation collapses, yes, but only because it was never the master structure. Tachyon-compatible histories replace linear influence with global coherence. The timeline you experience is real, but it is not sovereign. It is one thread in a web whose consistency holds more authority than any narrative of this happened first. Imagine standing inside a chamber where every wall reflects not light, but moments. You turn your head and see an event that from another angle appears to precede your own decision. You shift again and the same event appears to follow it. Yet nothing changes in the chamber. What changes is the path you take through the structure. The room is not lying to you. Your intuitions about temporal direction were never built for this architecture. Where then do you locate yourself? If the universe chooses entire self-consistent histories, your agency does not vanish. It becomes the way your trajectory satisfies the global pattern. You act not because the past compels you or the future dictates you, but because your action is one of the stable configurations the full space-time solution permits. And so the final image is simple. A message that arrives before it is sent, held in your hands. You read it, you understand it, you realize you were always part of the loop that delivered it. Cause and effect didn't disappear. They were absorbed into something larger.